Can you believe it? Week 5 already. Like, pretty amazing. Now next week, the lovely Sue Ann Yap is coming from Jade. By next week, I hope to have a large proportion of your assignments marked. We'll see how I can go with that, because I'm teaching 3 other subjects that have papers due at the moment too. But I want to have enough that I will be giving you some feedback, and I'm also going to be delivering after that class your next assignment topic. I have to write that between now and then as well. And so basically next week, whilst we're going to go through some of the elements that we need to go through for what's next, intention, I think, topic 4, we're also going to be looking at research, looking at what you did well and where there's opportunity for you to improve on your assignments as a group. Hopefully not long after that I'll be giving you your individual feedback, but often the group feedback you get a relatively good sense of where you sat in that space anyway. And we'll also be, and I know, look, a lot of you did legal research in intro. For some of you that's only a few weeks ago, for some of you it was a semester ago, for some maybe a little bit longer ago than that. I think it's always good to just, when you've done a problem and you got another one, just to provide some context for looking at it again, because it is a little bit standing in the fire hydrant when you do it the first time. So in the past, classes have found that valuable. The other thing that I'm going to do, possibly later tonight, more likely tomorrow morning, is as I am starting the process of giving you feedback on your work, I'm going to ask you to give me a little bit of feedback on mine. Now, most of you will know that there will be a course experience survey that comes out later in the year, and that's extremely valuable. And if you're going to pick a survey to do, you should do the proper formal one, where you basically share information. That information is taken very seriously, and it's used to consider how we do courses, through a range of different things. But the thing is about that survey data, I don't get the results of that until after you've got your final marks, just in case you're saying mean things about me and that impacts the way that I give you feedback. Kind of makes sense, right? So that means I learn from that for the next cohort, but I don't necessarily learn from it about how the best way is to manage this class. So I just, at week 5, with all of my classes, I sent out a Google form. It's anonymous. If you want to put your name to it, you're welcome to, but I don't know who gives me this feedback. And I pretty much ask you 4 questions. One is, what am I doing well that you want to see me keep on doing because it helps you learn? What am I doing a little bit of that you'd like to see me do more often because it helps you learn? What am I doing a little bit that you'd still like me to stop doing because it annoys you and it stops you from learning? What am I doing a lot of that is distracting from your learning that you'd like me to stop? You can make some other comments if you like. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's literally about you. So if you, and this is for OUA as well, if you have constructive feedback to give me, I would appreciate it, because it makes me better at my job and makes me feel self-righteous when at the end of the semester I get other feedback that says, well, she never did blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you never asked. So now's your time, okay? So they're the administrative things for today. Today, I really want to mix it up a little bit. I feel like we've had 4 weeks together where I've done a hell of a lot of talking, and you guys have done less so. So this week, finally, you guys had access to some pre-prepared materials in relation to consideration. Not much has changed. I'm going to do a race-through high-level overview to get us all on the same page and for us to ask some questions. The whole of the slide pack is here, but I've just what I want to do now is just go through the flowcharts, think about the cases, and then I want to do a problem in class. And maybe a couple of other activities depending on how much time we've got. Okay? Now, there are a couple of people who wanted to ask me questions before we started, and I just launched in because I sent them away while I was setting up to make sure the recording would work. Are they questions that you want to deal with everybody or first? So
Yeah, one of them, the question I had was, I listened to all of the recordings and sometimes it sounds really muffled.
Oh,
Yeah.
I listened to them myself and I thought, this is a big admission, but I prepared for this class partly by listening to those recordings myself while I cleaned my toilet. There was an irony there that I just kind of enjoyed. I was just thinking, I'm doing the shit while I'm cleaning up the shit. I just said that on a recording, but anyway.
It was mainly week 2.
Oh, okay, so old recording, not the ones on consideration.
No, consideration was
Sorry, I do try very hard to edit the sound as much as I can. That's one of the reasons why I send you all away, is I'm making sure I'm getting a level and all the rest of it. This is a noisy building. It's got a low hum, and sometimes if I walk too far away, it gets so I will just try and stay in the zone. It is also the reason that I repeat questions. Yeah, I can't.
I just thought to let you know. I mean, I
Yeah,
still
no,
don't
no,
really
thank
hear
you.
it because I listened to it in here.
Yeah.
But, yeah, just so you know.
Okay, if you can. If there's something that you don't understand or you miss, I think actually the desk recordings are usually better for OUA because there's none of that interruption. They also tend to go a little bit quicker because there are no questions, but then we have to have a question piece.
What's this recording?
Well, like I did for consideration.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so where I'm just standing there. Personally, I think they're more boring because I'm just standing there. They had blue hair in that one. That was kind of cool. Did you have
Yeah, I was just wondering, you know, for the mentor program, the principles of contract law, the review questions that you said, is there any answers or any way to look at the
Oh, you've asked me that by email.
Right.
It's a self-contained program, so they might say I've set them. I haven't set them. They're just questions that are in the program. So, look, I can have a look and see what's there. I think I said I would do that the other day, but honestly, I'm just in the fire hydrant at the moment. The answers that it gives you focus you back onto the textbook. So if you've got a specific question, it's probably better to come to me with the question than say, I didn't understand question 7 in Mentor. I am more likely, if you're asking me a question about something you want some understanding, to be able to respond in relation to that.
Oh yeah, it's just that once you finish the quiz, they don't let you see the questions or the answers again. That's why.
Because they set them up for... So if you can't remember the question that you got wrong or that you...
Oh yeah, because like it doesn't
Okay.
allow you to access.
All right, I'll see if I can go in there and have a look. Chances are I can't.
Okay. Oh, that's fine.
And it's just, it's a tool there to help you revise. I am more than happy when you have specific questions to address them straight away. It might be the lesson learned if you are doing those and you're worried about that. Take a screenshot as you go, just in case you need to drill back into it. The mentor questions, I think I've mentioned this before, they're very language specific. So they are kind of classic trick questions in a way. You have to be really precise on them. And in fact, the one that we're going to work through today is based on one of the ones that's in that, with a few Nolan-esque tweaks along the way. Any other questions before we get started about what we're doing, about contract law generally? This is contract law if you should be taught somewhere else. Everybody good? Okay, let's talk about consideration. So what is consideration?
It's the exchange of something of value for a promise.
The exchange of something of value for a promise. Fantastic. Why do we need consideration? Or do we need consideration?
Create the contract.
To create the contract.
Yeah.
Good answer. Like at the end of the day, we need it because common law of Australia says in order to have a contract, you need to have, say them with me, agreement comprising offer and acceptance or otherwise consensus ad idem. Did you notice now that you're 5-week-old contract lawyers, I don't say at the beginning, I would say agreement, offer and acceptance, maybe sort of, sometimes something else. I'm now using the Latin consensus ad idem. That is a mark of respect in its own wacky way. Agreement, consideration, intention and certainty. Agreement, consideration, intention and certainty. We have all four. We have an agreement at common law. So yeah, we need it because it's one of the elements. We need it also because that element is built out of this common law idea of the bargain. And the Latin we use is a quid pro quo, a this for that. It's also because we're creating this idea of a private law between the parties, where in order for them to be able to create their own law, the common law sees that there needs to be some sort of value. But I think when we explore this idea of sufficiency of consideration, we very quickly come to the view that the value piece is really in name only for a number of reasons. Okay, so what I want to do, let's have a look here, is start with this idea of consideration being a precondition for a legally enforceable agreement. And then I want to, sorry, is somebody asking a question? No. I want to actually work through some of these flowcharts that I use, just one by one. In fact, this mega flowchart. Just make sure we're on the same page, and then we'll do some activities to work through that. So I'm not planning in this context to spend a lot of time drilling into facts and cases as I have with you before. Do we need to turn the lights down for people to be able to see that? This is where we're going to end up, okay? So I'm going to pull this apart a little bit. This is where we're going to end up. And so I want to start with this question. I think this is the only slide where it's red, and so it's a little bit hard to see. But our question here is framed in a particular way. Is there legally sufficient consideration? The subtext there is for the purpose of establishing the element of consideration for establishing whether a contract exists or not. So we're looking at, is there legally sufficient consideration? And in some ways, when we start that question, we can remind ourselves that if the agreement itself is made under a deed, or if there is a promissory estoppel of some kind, then we don't need consideration at all. So equity will support the finding of an agreement even if there is no consideration in two circumstances. And you'll learn a lot more about the promissory estoppel bit in particular in advanced contract, and then again, I assume, when you get to equity and trusts. But the first of these is just when you have a contract that's signed on a deed. So historically, deeds they needed to be on vellum. Anybody know what vellum is? Deer skin, yeah. As a vegetarian of more than 30 years standing, it's kind of like the documentary equivalent of veal. So deerskin, parchment paper. These days, that requirement has disappeared. There's legislation that says a deed needs to be in paper. Deeds need to be signed, sealed, and delivered. Not just a pop song, as it turns out. So signed, we understand what signature is. So in a common law sense, though, signature has actually always been interpreted very broadly, because for a very long time not everybody could write. So some sort of mark that indicated the person was enough. Sealed, literally sealed with wax and a stamp, was the old school way of doing it. These days, not so much. The sealing, the physical seal, isn't so important. Delivered. What do you imagine that delivered means? They're so dirty, there is absolutely nothing I can do. Sorry for the recording, that's my glasses that I can't see through. What do we imagine that delivered means?
Given directly to the person.
Given directly to the person. Sometimes that's what delivery is. It's literally a physical delivery of the document. Now that's important though, because it's not enough to have just signed it. It's not enough to have just sealed it. You need both those things, and you need to physically handed over to somebody else. So it's the act of that formal act. And when we think about our objective test, that kind of makes sense to me. We need to do something that provides an objective understanding that we intended to be bound at that point. A lot of things happen with deeds too, where there'll be a third party holding the deed. And any of you who work in large law firms will have seen the position happen where everybody signed everything, but the parties agree that they won't exchange documents until a particular point in time. And until that point in time, it's like nothing's happened. Until you've actually got the copy with the other person's signature on it, even if they signed it many weeks before, it's only when both documents exchange. And that happens often outside of the deed environment anyway, but it's still an important thing to be aware of. The actual legislation now, and the case law supports this, has a much broader concept of delivery. Delivery is essentially doing any objective act that demonstrates an intention to be bound by the document. So why all that rigmarole? We don't have consideration, but we can actually get around it by just having a deed. And yet it has all of these requirements about it. Why are we thinking, what would be the value in doing it as a deed?
It's in writing.
Sorry?
It's in writing. So
It's in writing? Yeah, well, actually there's value in putting things in writing anyway, not the least of which we get paid for doing it, cha-ching. But it does actually add to the certainty when it's done well, absolutely. But there are we could have it written on a piece of paper that wasn't stated to be a deed. So these days you tell it's a deed because it says it's a deed. It'll use words like signed, sealed and delivered. It will say deed on the front of it. There's some evidence that the parties intended it to be a deed. The vellum and the stamping no longer so important. So why, if I've got two identical instruments, two identical pieces of paper, one has deed written on it and says this deed has been entered into by these parties, so that party A will give all of his assets to party B, signed, sealed, delivered, exchanged. The other piece of paper does exactly the same thing, so it says nothing else. So party B has no obligations at all, so there's no consideration. Court will uphold the obligation on party A under a deed and not under a document that just says it's an agreement. Why? How does that make any sense at all? It's okay if it doesn't, because that just means that I'm adding value in some way, because I can tell you my point of view anyway. But think about it.
Is it based on a tradition that a deed should be considered to be legally binding, and therefore if you sign a deed, you know therefore that it's going to be legally binding and you don't need to provide a bargain?
In large part, yeah, it's the seriousness of it. Think back when we talked about Fitness First and Chong. Fitness First and Chong. The act of signing demonstrated the seriousness. With a deed, there's a hell of a lot more, I'm going to use the technical legal expression, palaver, associated with delivering a deed. Or there was in the olden days anyway. So in a sense, the seriousness of the obligation is demonstrated through the sense of the agreement, or the documentation, the format. Where in a common law agreement, which might be in writing, might be verbal, might be partly in writing, partly verbal, might be determined through an objective assessment of the conduct of the parties, might be a 7,000-page document with 15 annexures that's expected to cover a relationship over a 50-year period. That's the common law environment. And under the common law environment, how we tell that it's a serious obligation is both parties have one. In order to get a right, you swap it for an obligation. But as it turns out, it might be that that obligation only has to be very small. Of course, you don't get out of jail free here with deeds, and don't want to do too much of John Glover's work for him when you get there, because there are all these maxims too. So sure, it might be binding, but then we have this idea that equity won't assist a volunteer. So, and often the promissory estoppels, how they're actually working is to say, well, yeah, you have that right, we're going to stop you from exercising it because it wouldn't be fair or right in some way. So putting all your hope in the idea of equity might not help you. So a good draftsperson, even when they're using a deed for a range of different reasons, might be quite explicit about the consideration. But particularly if you're concerned that the consideration might have happened in the past, something we're going to talk about shortly, or if you're concerned that the consideration might take the form or be seen as an existing legal duty, or that there might be some issues with the certainty. So particularly, let me use an example here, in a non-disclosure agreement. So where two parties are entering into a contract where they promise to keep each other's secrets, to actually be certain as to what the secret is requires you to know in advance what information you might give somebody in the future and be able to define what the secret is. And we can talk about that a little bit later. If you're concerned about those things, often you'll use a deed, but you will say for consideration receipt of which is acknowledged. You might be a bit vague about it, but there'll be some sort of consideration. Questions, concerns, thoughts? So, basically, once we've worked out whether we've got a legally sufficient agreement, that we need to ask the question, I should say, then there are two complementary questions that we need to ask. The first is, can we see a benefit detriment? And if we can, is that benefit and detriment a consequence of a bargain, a quid pro quo? It's not enough for there just to be a benefit for one party in exchange for a detriment and vice versa. Those benefits and detriments need to match the deal that's been made. So, in organising all our thoughts around whether or not a benefit detriment requirement has been met, we need to think about what the promises are. So in most bilateral contracts, at the moment they are made, both parties have something that they need to do. So in most bilateral, in all bilateral contracts that's true, and mostly that means that both, in a simple contract, that both parties have made a promise. Now, one party will have made a promise to do something or to transfer something to someone else. I'm vastly oversimplifying here. But one party will be selling something, whether they're services or goods. And the other party will be the buyer. So their promise is the promise to pay. Now, quite often, it happens, the whole contract is executed milliseconds later. Money is paid, goods are handed over. But the consideration moves. I think the easiest way to think about consideration is it moves from both sides. Both parties get something. They get a promise that is given to them. A promise to deliver the goods, a promise to deliver the service, or a promise to get the money. And sometimes it's services for services, services for goods. It doesn't sort of matter. Both parties get something. Both parties will give something. The next question is the Woolen Mills question. Is the thing that you're doing in exchange for the promise you got actually in exchange for that promise? Or are you doing it for a different reason? Have the parties reached a bargain? And that's very much caught up in that meeting of the minds idea as well. So it's not enough to agree. We might agree wholeheartedly that I should do everything and you guys should do nothing. We might have consensus ad idem there, but we need to have the consideration as well. So if we agree wholeheartedly that I will create these slide packs in exchange for you reading the exchange pack, then we've both got something to do. We've both got something that we get a benefit from. Only actually, I'm not doing it for you, I'm doing it for the university. The reason that I'm doing this is not part of our bargain at all. It's my job. Every semester I say, I'm going to come into classes with better analogy, I'm not going to make them up as I go, and yet I never do. And before classes now I think, now what analogies will I need? They never come to me. Questions, concerns, thoughts? I'll go over here first.
Well, you can call it consideration for options in this lesson.
Options are the question of the semester, I've decided. We've had a few. Yeah, can we come back to that? Because we'll do a couple of role play things as we go. So are you guys asking about options as well, or are you sick of them yet?
Just wonder why.
No, I wonder why. In last night's drop-in shoot, we spent half the time talking about options. So I've made the recording. It's just every time I go to put it up to YouTube, I have to use my computer for something else, and so it's not there yet. But we'll talk about options as we go. I think that'll be a good example as we work through one of the activities I want to do. So just remind me there. Justin, you had a question too.
Oh, so just to be clear with the consideration, it has to move both ways. As in, like, for it to be consideration, both parties together.
Well, another way of thinking about that is if we use the textbook definition, consideration is the price for the promise. And if we think about the moment in time when a contract is formed, both parties have made promises. So both parties are receiving the benefit of a promise. So each party needs to pay for the promise they're getting the benefit of. So consideration moves both ways, is another way of thinking about it. Both parties, we need a benefit and a detriment. And if I'm suffering a detriment so that you get a benefit, then you're going to suffer a detriment so I get a benefit. Now, interestingly enough, the benefit could actually go to somebody else, but the detriment needs to stay with the promisor. So once we've asked and satisfied ourselves about these questions, we need to think about whether or not, in order for it to be legally sufficient, it complies with the rules. And whether or not it's good consideration. So what do I mean by good consideration? I mean sufficient consideration. And we've got a number, 5 basic tests that we need to think about. Consideration needs to move from the promisee and not necessarily to the promisor. I think I just said detriment to promisor a minute ago just to confuse you and see if you were listening. I have a tendency to get my E's and my O's back to front. Consideration needs to move from the promisee and not necessarily to the promisor. So, good example of this. I thought I'd changed it on the slide, but I obviously haven't. Thomas and Thomas is a good example of this. And the textbook actually puts it really nicely. We use our lost cat example again. If I decide that I'm really worried about Jono's lost cat, so I don't want to have a lost cat anymore, I don't really want a cat. I'm worried about Jono's lost cat, I'm going to pay a reward to anybody who finds Jono's cat. Okay, you find his cat, Michelle, thank you, you found the cat. You return it to Jono, he gets the benefit of the cat. It's a unilateral contract. I am now bound to pay you $500 because your bit of the consideration is done. So you basically suffer a detriment. The detriment is your time and energies in locating the cat and returning it to Jono. You then get a benefit for that detriment, my $500. I get a detriment. I suffer the $500 cost, but I don't get the benefit Jono does. That's perfectly okay. But the other way around, we have a problem. If Jono says, I'm really worried about my lost cat, I'd like everybody to go and look for it, and whoever finds it, Kath will pay them $500. Sounds good to you? Yeah, you would definitely do that, even for a cat. Great. But we've got this problem. So Michelle, she goes out, she finds the cat, she gives it back to Jono, and I'm like, hang on a minute, I didn't promise that. I didn't make a promise to the world. Jono did. Jono's promise is quite clear. I'm going to pay the $500. But the detriment, so your detriment in that circumstance, or his detriment, needs to flow to me. I need to have some benefit in that context. What's next? Consideration needs to be adequate, but not, other way around. Consideration doesn't need to be adequate, but it must be sufficient. Usually we express that as consideration needs to be sufficient, but doesn't need to be adequate. So does anybody remember, did anybody read Nestle case there? I think of that as the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory case. So in that case, what do you want to know? Anybody want? It was basically about what the value of chocolate wrappers were. And the court came back and said it really doesn't matter what they're worth. It's what they're worth to you that matters. It's not the court's job to look at the adequacy of the consideration. Now there's a key Australian case here that's really important. Anybody remember which one it is? Woolworths and Kelly. Decision of Justice Kirby. In the slide pack there's a list of what the reasons were, and I can push to it. But Kirby does a really good job of explaining why consideration, or the adequacy of consideration, is not the role of the courts. Anybody want to hazard a guess, memory in relation to that? Or just think about it logically.
It's very subjective, so you talked about value and measuring value.
Yeah, measuring value and the subjectivity of it.
You talked
Oh, I
about.
have such a foghorn voice. Everybody else is so quiet.
You also talked about that lawyers aren't economists. They're not
Lawyers aren't economists, absolutely. Though they seem to have forgotten that in competition law cases, so they have lots in that space.
And also certainty in that if they were to delve into the realm of adequacy, that certainty would be maybe eroded or
Yeah.
at least.
So it goes to the certainty piece, astute observation.
And also evidential law.
And the costs, the certainty issues, so a range. It's not the role of the court to think about the value of the bargain. I think about this as a commercial person. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. So all of this, in almost any transaction, an economist would say that if we're going to put any money on the table, if we're going to pay for something, then we necessarily believe that the amount of money we're paying is worth less to us than the value of the thing that we're getting. It of course assumes a rational purchaser in all occasions, and I think some of us would wonder whether we're always rational about the purchases we make. But that $1 in our bank account is worth less to us than a Mars bar or a Freddo Frog or whatever it happens to be. So price is what we pay, value is what we get. And I think Nestle is a really good example of just because something's It's just a piece of paper that has no value particularly to anybody else. To a particular collector, it'll have a huge amount of value. So consideration needs to be sufficient, but it doesn't need to be adequate. Next, past consideration is not good consideration. So Roscola and Thomas here. So what does that mean?
You can't go and say you've given me something before and then later on say I will give you $50 for that thing you did for me.
And we've got our two illustrations in the sailors' cases here, Stilk and Myrick, and can't remember the name of it. So what is it? Hartley and Ponsonby. Thank you. So we start off, so the older of the two cases, which is Stilk, I think. Somebody's going to remind me and correct me along the way. We've got a group of seamen sailing across the waters. They've got a contract to sail from London back to wherever and back again. Halfway along, there's a mutiny. They go from a crew of 15, 13, something like that, down to 10, 8. Captain of the ship says, if you get us back safely, we'll share the wages we would have paid to those mutinous crew across the rest of you. The sailors agreed to come back. They get back, and lo and behold, they're not being paid. So they go and sue for that additional wages, and the court says, well, no. You already had... Actually, I'm going into existing legal duty, I've just realised.
Yeah.
Why are you not stopping me? That's all right. They're actually really... I see these as all part of the same thing. Because the past consideration is kind of the same thing. It's something that you had agreed to before. You change it up. So I'm going to talk about existing legal duty first, because I'm in the middle of my lovely story about sailors. Throw these other two. Now, there we go. Existing legal would be last. So it's asking that question about, well, what was your duty? But if the duty substantially changes, so when we lose half our crew and it's actually dangerous to travel back, it's a new contract. So we don't have the same issue. What do we use? Roscola is one of the horse cases, isn't it? So Roscola's the case around at the time that the horse was purchased, the contract's done, new owner of the horse is leading the horse away and says, oh, by the way, is he a good horse? Is he fit? And he said, and the owner, or the previous owner at that stage says, absolutely no problem with the horse. So the question then became, was that promise, because it turned out the horse did have issues, I think it died very shortly afterwards. Question became, was that term, that promise, I promise you that you'll have no issues with the horse, was that an enforceable promise? New owner of the horse is saying, well, I paid for the horse, so it should be an enforceable promise. And the court says, well, yeah, you paid for the horse when you entered into the contract for the horse, but you'd already paid at that stage. The contract was complete. This is a new extra promise. And we need consideration for that extra promise. And the amount of money you've paid in the past can't be good consideration, because it's past consideration. Part payment of a debt is not good consideration. So this is the rule in Pinnell's case. Pinnell's case is so old that we only see it referred to in other cases, really. And that essentially says that if I owe you money and I am really at risk of not paying the full amount, and you say to me, okay, I'll waive, say, here, actually, here's some money I prepared earlier. Where's it gone? Big money. Would you like to lend me this $100?
No.
$100. He's loaned it to me. I've spent it over here on Wild Women in Song. and I owe it to you at 6:18. You can see the time tonight, and I am looking here, and I am really at risk of having no more than, say, I think I can probably give you 70.
Okay.
So if I give you this 70 on the due date, will you release me of my obligation to pay the whole 100? Because if I don't give you this, I'm not going to be able to give you anything. So he said yes. I hand it on. Now if he then comes and says to me, as you are quite likely to do, where's my other $30? Would you like? I've got a minute to go before it's due.
I'll wait.
But you want my other $30?
I do.
Like, well, that's not
Two and
fair.
10. That's the other
If
10.
I'd known, oh, is it? Oh, did I give you extra money? It's only 10.
You're lying to me. I have the money.
So there, he's got 90. It's like, well, that's not fair. If I'd known that he was going to sue me for the balance, I wouldn't have paid him that 90. I would have paid one of my more friendly creditors, or I would have just got myself some more wine, women, and song. So what happens? Does he win? Do I win? Spinall case says he wins. That the promise to forego that $10, as it turned out, is only an enforceable promise if I pay some consideration for it. Now maybe I did, because you accepted my offer of 70 and I paid an extra 20 for it.
True.
So maybe that's a very complex argument around that. But in the little videos that Dave has made, Dave Goodwin, he talks about this idea of, you know, an old sand shoe. So I could give you my smelly socks and that $70, and if that's what you agreed to, the smelly socks become the consideration for that agreement to forego the debt. It's now 6:18. The other thing that I did is I actually paid early. So that might have been the other way that I got away with it, because the benefit that you got was less money earlier, so you got a benefit, so that's the consideration. But if I paid it at the due date on the due time, I wouldn't. Make sense? What else have we not talked about here? Pre-existing. Really just trying to do a high level so we can play with some of the ideas. Now, the study of law is as much about understanding the rules by looking at the exceptions as anything else. So there are a key set of exceptions that apply to all of these. So, for example, in the existing legal, well, and when we think about part payment of a debt, it's just another form of existing legal duty, isn't it? I was already bound to pay $100 at 6:18. So one of the exceptions there is actually probably the one I have the most problem with these old cases, and that's the Hirachand, Pamachand and Temple case. So in that case, Mr. Pamachand loaned Mr. Temple's son some money. So I'm assuming that Temple Jr. was spending some time in India, having a lovely time. He borrowed some money, most likely for wine, women and song. And then he went back to the old country, and the money lender is saying, excuse me, I need my money paid. So Daddy steps into the breach here and sends a letter saying, here's some of what my son owes you. If you bank this cheque, I'll take it as your acceptance of completion of the matter. And then the money lender banked the cheque and immediately wrote off and said, I'm not accepting this as completion of the matter, I want the rest of my money, thank you very much. Now, the rule in Pingle's case would say if the son had sent the money, that money was due at that point, that wouldn't matter. The balance would still be due. But the court found that in this particular case, that Mr. Temple, being a stranger to the contract, it would be a fraud on Mr. Temple, a fraud to the stranger to the contract, if that money had been accepted and the balance of it still required. Now, I have no doubt in my mind, I'd love it if somebody could change my view on this, but no doubt in my mind that if Mr. Temple had been the money lender and Hirachand Pamachand had been the borrower, that the result might have, or the borrower's father, the result might have come out quite differently. But that's the law that we have. So it does impact the way clever people do debt collection from time to time too, and how clever people respond to debt collection by trying essentially to ensure that they proffer lesser amounts with a view to having those amounts banked or even held. So it was, the judgment is broad enough to say that even if he hadn't banked it, if he just held on to the cheque and not returned it, that he would have been successful. Bill? Sorry?
You say coming from a third party. So, because I was dealing with a matter going through debt collectors and so forth. So it came from a third party, but the cheque was from the party that I held the debt with.
Yeah, well, that's if it's been delivered by an agent, it's still the underlying. Remember too, we're talking about common law. So we've got a whole heap of statutory overlays that sit in the middle as well. But as a general rule, if you get a cheque from somebody in full and final settlement of a matter that you don't want full and finally settled, you return that cheque straight away. And you return it without prejudice. Or you immediately get the sign-offs that you need to ensure that you haven't prejudiced the balance of your debt.
So Kathy, is that if the person giving the part payment has said, is this enough, or mate, settle with this? What if they say, can I give this and give you the rest later?
But that's a different thing.
Yeah.
I'm talking about consideration for the promise to waive the balance of the debt.
Yeah, so it's when they ask. That's it.
So at that point, you either reach agreement and you need consideration for that agreement, or you haven't changed the agreement at all. So now in fact, I'm getting to these other exceptions which can work in this other way. So Mumaseki is the Australian case, and Williams and Roffey is the English case that happened at around the same time. But they look at this idea of a practical benefit. So in Musumeci, I've got to get the pronunciation right. Musumeci, thank you. So in Musumeci, the Musumekis were tenants in a shopping centre at a fruit and veg store. And they were the only fruit and veg store in that shopping centre for a little while. Then the landlords decided that they would put, I think it was a Coles or a Woolworths or something in there that had fresh fruit and vegetables as well. So that was impacting the Musumeci's income. And they complained about this and threatened to break their lease and leave. And so the owners of the shopping centre said, no, don't do that. It's not good for us to have empty shops. You know, we need a vibrant, full shopping centre so lots of people come. We'll reduce your rent. They did that for a little while, and then they decided they wanted to put the rent up again. So the Musumeci said, hang on a minute, you promised to reduce our rent, and we want to pay the lesser rent. And the shopping centre owners said, well, no, we've got a contract here that says your rent is X, so you need to pay X. there was no consideration paid for that promise. There was no alteration of the agreement. We just did that for a little while because we had a discretion to do it. We've changed our minds. That's the contract. We're going to enforce the contract. So what did the court find? This went to the High Court.
The consideration for keeping the full shopping centre was sufficient for the reduced rent.
So the language that they used was there was a practical benefit. So there was, Winnerdell, the owners of the shopping centre, got a practical benefit from having a full shopping centre. It made their tenancies more attractive, and so there was consideration. It might not have been adequate consideration, but it was a practical benefit, so it was sufficient. So see, the pattern that we have here each time is we have an existing agreement, then something happens where one party wants to vary the agreement and the other party does something to accede to that or to demonstrate that they're happy enough with it, and then goes back on that idea later. And the question for the court is that variation to the original arrangement, is that actually an enforceable agreement? And for it to be an enforceable agreement, what does it need? Agreement, offer acceptance of consensus ad idem, consideration, intention, and certainty. And so the question that we've been looking at in each case here is the certainty element. The consideration element. Blah, 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 blah. The English case, William and Roffey, really kind of similar. So in that case, and there was a developer, I think they had carpenters working on the sub parts of the development. They quoted to do a job. Very quickly it became clear that they'd underquoted. The head contractor, the person who had hired this carpenter, has his own contract with the underlying developer, and he has to have something finished by a certain date. And he's not going to finish it unless the carpenters finish. And the carpenters are saying, no, actually we can't afford to do this, we're going broke, we're losing money hand over fist, we just got to shut it down or we'll go broke. So we're going to walk away from the contract, sue us if you have to. And they say, no, don't do that because I'll end up in trouble. How about I pay you extra? They paid them a little bit of that extra up front, but they didn't pay them the balance. So when they were sued for the balance, they said, look, hang on a minute, existing legal duty. We don't know about that, existing legal duty. We had a contract, they said they would do this for whatever it was, let's call it 100 quid. And I needed to promise, so I needed to talk to them about giving them an extra 100 to get them moving, and I paid them 20, that's enough. I just needed to get it done, otherwise I was going to breach my contract. Court said, so you got a practical benefit from that. You got a practical benefit because you would have been sued under your head contract. You needed that done to meet that date, and you agreed at the time. Scary stuff sometimes. Other exemptions that we have, a bona fide compromise. I hate it when I don't write the names of the cases on the slides. Case here involved, good example case anyway, is the one where somebody sold a house to somebody else. There were a whole heap of defects in the house. And the purchaser said, I'm not going to complete the sale until you fix these defects. And the vendor genuinely believed that they had to fix the defects, even though actually under the contract they probably didn't. Well, they didn't. I think it was found subsequently that they didn't. So they promised that they would fix the defects. So the exchange was completed, purchaser moves forward, but 5 years later the vendor still hasn't done anything to fix it. So he gets sued. They're saying, well, actually under the original contract they didn't have any obligation to do that. And the court said, well, actually, you were sued, or you thought you were going to be sued to do that. and you believed at the time that that suit would have been successful. Now, you were ill-advised, but you believed at the time you would have been successful, or the other side would have been successful. So you made a bona fide offer to... So bona fide just means honest, true, good. So in good faith, I think, is the correct pronunciation. So an in good faith compromise of that suit. As it turned out, you would have won hand down if you'd fought it, but you didn't know that. And in good faith, you made that promise. And in good faith, the other party, who also genuinely believed they were on the side of good and right, accepted your agreement to do that. So because both parties genuinely believed that there was a suit that the vendor would have lost, then that's sufficient consideration for the vendor's promise to do the make good. Then the other thing that we think about in this context too is the extent to which these kind of issues that arise when we've got an existing contract and one party wants to vary it, the extent to which we're actually talking about a termination of the existing contract and the creation of a new one. And again, to create a new contract, all we need to do is be able to demonstrate that we've got agreement comprising offer and acceptance, consensus ad idem, consideration, certainty and intention. Not necessarily in that order. So how's that? Everything you need to know about consideration in one slide. This is the most boring video ever for the OUA students. Sorry about that. No colour and movement today. Questions, concerns, frustrations?
In these cases, it would be the job for lawyers to present what they think the consideration would be. The courts won't ever read into what they think.
Mostly the courts won't reason into what the consideration might be. Occasionally you get sort of those renegade judges. Denning was famous for this, suddenly coming out with bits of law that weren't really argued in the motions. But on the whole, the courts deal with what is presented to them. The reality is these formation elements are hardly ever in dispute in real life. One of the reasons that I know I can make a recording 6 months ago and then go and do the prep and see, okay, is there anything new or sexy that I need to talk about that might have changed since then? And yeah, there's really nothing. Because these things are not disputed very often. Mostly when we go to court, everybody will just assume a contract exists. And they'll be having a fight about what a term means or whether somebody has in fact done what they promised to do. But it's very rarely that we pull apart the elements at that level anymore. But we do get these odd things. So Williams and Roffey and Musumeci, for example, are relatively recent cases, I think from the 80s. So we get these, so that idea of a practical benefit exception is a relatively new idea. And when we talk next week about intention, Ermogenes, which is the key case, like for all intents and purposes, makes most of the other cases in the intention section sort of historical artifacts, like they're interesting to know about, but it basically changes the presumption so much, brings it into this century. Well, it's actually, I think, in the last century, but that's as close as we get. So, you know, sometimes we have these radical changes, but not all that often.
Does consideration need to be communicated? So, for example, with the building, the carpenters and the developer builders, however when, one party paid the carpenters because they were worried about being sued for not completing their job. Have they not communicated that whatsoever, the reasons for why they're paying the extra $100,000? Could that then...
Question.
Would that be argued as consideration if they've never communicated that at all?
So there's an evidentiary issue there, I suspect. So the question is, just so everybody hears it, is that if in Williams and Roffey, I think is the head contractor, or if they hadn't communicated to the carpenter that unless they finished the job on time, they'd be at risk of breaching their own contract, and that was the reason they were paying the extra money. If they just paid it without explaining why, would the result have been the same? It would obviously be harder to prove what the practical benefit was if they didn't know. But I don't know. It's a really good question. I'd like to ponder on it a little bit. I really don't know. In Musumeci, I don't think there was. Oh no, there was. The evidence included a conversation about concerns about having empty shops.
Well, I think it would have to be communicated. Otherwise, you could receive the benefit that you actually weren't aware of at the time.
Well, and one of the issues.
And they've argued that against you. They're like, I didn't even realise that.
And then we get the Woolen Mills problem, that the consideration isn't part of the bargain. So that would be, sorry, I'm thinking out loud here too, but understanding how these things fit together. But these are very much framed as exemptions. So I'm going to turn the recording off now, unless there's more questions that we want to talk about.